Have you ever noticed that Sutter's Fort State Historic Park sits on a hill? It's actually one of the highest points in all of Sacramento, California. It's hard to imagine with all the buildings, cars, and streets how this area truly used to look as a marshland, and Sutter's Fort sat on top of a high knoll. Now, when John Sutter arrived here in August 1839, he and his landing party had noticed that there was driftwood and debris about 20 feet in the air in the trees near the confluence of the Sacramento and American Rivers. This area flooded all the time. And looking at the Sacramento and American Rivers today, you'll notice that they are a bit higher during the winter. In many cases, almost as high as the Tower Bridge and I Street Bridge right now. This area was known as Nisempewanon, land of the Nisenan people. There was about 30 different villages living in the area that John Sutter would eventually claim as his under a land grant that he will get in 1841. In some of the native villages, when Sutter arrives about a mile north of here at where 28th Street meets the American River, that is the site of Sutter's Landing. Some of the villages actually tell Sutter as well that this area floods all the time and to build on high ground. This is that high ground. Besides where Sutter's Fort is today, there's only one other area in the downtown and midtown grid that is higher than everything else. Poverty Ridge at where V and 20th Streets is today. This is where Sutter's Fort was built, and Sutter's Fort will stand through all the floods in Sacramento's history. That's not to say that the floods still didn't impact Sutter's Fort, but Sutter's Fort lived through all the floods. Let's talk about those floods. Throughout the 1840s, droughts were an issue, and those droughts impacted the yield of the agricultural crops in New Helvetia. But there was also times where John Sutter wrote in the diary of the rivers being high, at one point even saying that the river was 8 feet higher than it usually was. However, there was not that much rain in the winter of 1848 to 1849, so that when Sacramento City is established along the waterfront, it's setting itself up for failure. John Sutter wanted to build a town called Sutterville, which was going to be southwest of the fort on a high bluff where William Land Park and the Sacramento Zoo is today, but right on the waterfront, proved to be a failure in early Sacramento's history. Heavy rains in December 1849 led to a real rise in the rivers to where on January 8th, 1850, Sacramento was underwater at least a few feet. That didn't stop Sacramento. Sacramento decided to build a levee system around the city. It was going to survive at the confluence of the Sacramento and American Rivers. By January 1850, though, that ceases operations here at Sutter's Fort. This was in the early days of the gold rush. This was where mercantile shops opened up to sell goods to incoming gold miners. But by January 1850, those same businessmen wanted to have stores along the waterfront. The flood prevented some of the last auctions held place to sell a lot of the materials from here that businessmen didn't even want to move 2 miles to their new store along the waterfront. By the end of January 1850, though, Sutter's Fort is abandoned besides the McClellan family, who is living in the central building, and a hospital that is being operated in the southeast bastion of the fort. In December 1852, another flood in Sacramento's history did not affect the fort. Floodwaters didn't reach here. It's largely abandoned. However, along the west wall here, apparently a section of the wall fell, collapsed, and killed a, quote, prized cow. In December 1861, you start to see the real large flood in Sacramento's history, which culminates in a January 9th, 1862 flood that results in Sacramento being underwater for at least a couple months. Several feet of water standing throughout the city. People became very accustomed to actually traveling from one business to the next by rowboat. This is where the result of this flood will lead to Sacramento raising the buildings and streets to prevent further flooding and building an even larger levee system. It is during January 1862, though, is where the rest of Sutter's Fort is destroyed, except for the central building in the middle. By this point, Olive Lawson and her family are living in the central building. She actually opens up the property here as a relief area for people to come to during the floods. It is only Sutter's Fort and Poverty Ridge that's actually standing outside of the flood waters. So this is where you have a lot of people coming to live during that flood. Olive Lawson is actually given recognition by the Howard Benevolent Society in the Sacramento Daily Union newspaper in February 1862 for being so welcoming of people during this flood. But it is during the flood that you have the destruction of the rest of the perimeter walls of Sutter's Fort. Why was the perimeter walls and rooms destroyed? Well, much of the sections had already been destroyed for building materials by those early merchants moving their stores to the waterfront. But what was left, remnants of the Northwest Bastion especially, was used to make the footings and parts of a bridge to extend beyond Burn Slough. Burn Slough was a small stream that connected with the American River. Today, the pond at Sutter's Fort State Historic Park and the pond at McKinley Park sit on the outline of what was originally Burn Slough. So after January 1862, only the central building remained of Sutter's Fort until the fort was restored and reconstructed in the 1890s, which was finished in 1895, and we've been a museum ever since. And by 1897, the city had finally expanded out this far. The city was tired of Burn Slough overflowing all the time during the winter. Burn Slough was filled in at that time as well.